Well, thank you all again for coming. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Catherine Dooley. I'm the lead instructional coordinator with College Steps, and I'll be kind of facilitating the panel today. But I'd like to introduce you to our two panelists. So first we have Dr. Melissa Wells. Melissa, would you please introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your current position, but also any other positions you've had in the education field in the past, just to kind of give students a sense of where you're coming from.
Absolutely. So my name is Dr. Melissa Wells. I currently am an assistant professor in the College of Education at the University of Mary Washington. And in that role, I teach different classes. My main specialization, though, is literacy, especially early literacy and arts integration as well. And before joining the faculty at Mary Washington, I was an elementary literacy coach, a third grade teacher, and a kindergarten teacher in the public schools in South Carolina.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And Nancy, can you go ahead and introduce yourself, please?
Hi all, I'm Nancy. I'm the Regional Director for College Steps, so I oversee all of our programs in New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. Before I stepped into this position, I was a program coordinator at our campus at the County College of Morris, so I helped found our first program in New Jersey. But before that, I actually started my career as a middle school teacher in New Orleans right after Katrina. And I started there as a reading specialist, then became a special educator, and eventually stepped into the role of a special education coordinator. I grew up in New Jersey, so eventually I decided to move back home and worked in Newark at a charter school system called Uncommon Schools. So most of my career was actually spent in charter schools, and later on I'd love to talk about the difference between being a teacher in the public schools versus a public charter school.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And for all of the participants here, as we go along, if you have any questions for the panelists, we will have some time at the end during the last 20 minutes or so for you to ask any questions that you have. But if you think of questions as we're going along, you can go ahead and type them into the chat, and we'll just save those for the end. We'll come back to those when we get to the Q&A. But otherwise, once we get to the Q&A at the end, you'll be able to kind of unmute yourself or raise your hand to ask your questions then. Okay. So my first question that I want to ask both of you, and I guess we'll start with you, Melissa, if that's okay, is just to say a little bit about how you first got into this field. Was education something that you were always interested in? Did you kind of start going to college with the idea that this was the direction you were going to go? Or did you have any kind of changes in your major, your career path, or sort of your focus at any point?
So I knew from a very early age that I wanted to be a teacher, and it really happened when I was in fifth grade. I was able to volunteer with a kindergarten class at lunch, so we would help with, opening like the milk and the ketchup and the mustard and all those kinds of things. Mustard packets are the worst, by the way. And so then that turned into helping out some in the classroom and helping them at recess as well. And I just really loved working with young children. My parents were both also involved with care for young children. My dad is a pediatrician, and my mother was also an elementary educator who turned down the road to become a college professor as well. So I had that love of children modeled for me from a very, very young age. So I knew going to college that I did want to be eventually an early childhood teacher. And so the way that the teaching credential worked in South Carolina is first I had to get my elementary degree so I could teach grades 2 through 6. And so then I returned for my master's degree knowing that I wanted to be able to teach kindergarten one day. And so that was kind of how I went into it, knowing that I did want to work with young children one day. In that journey, I gathered some new experiences. So I started teaching third grade because I was not certified to teach kindergarten and there were no openings. But while I was teaching third grade, I worked with a group of students who were labeled as 1 to 2 years behind in reading. And that really got me wondering, what is this reading process? Why are some of our students not clicking with reading? And what can we do to better serve them? So then when I did move down to kindergarten, I simultaneously began my doctoral degree in language and literacy because I wanted to learn more about it. And because of the way that lined up, South Carolina actually had just started in 2014 a Read to Succeed initiative, which put elementary literacy coaches in every school. And so because I was working on my degree, they asked me to step away from the classroom to become an elementary literacy coach. So that wasn't something I was anticipating. My dream was to be an elementary teacher, but this was a really unique opportunity to get to see K through 5 different literacy practices that were going on, pushing into other people's classrooms, offering some of that professional development support. And so then because of that, I started working more with teachers, and I realized that working with teachers is actually pretty awesome as well. And so then I segued up to working in the college environment. So all of my elementary experience, again, was in the South Carolina public schools, and all of those were Title I schools. So students with higher economic needs and things like that. One of my schools was an arts integration school, so I really did enjoy getting to infuse that into my curriculum because I also am a musician. And then one of my schools had a very high Latina population, so I enjoyed getting to advocate for families and for students who are speakers of other languages as well. So kind of not exactly where I knew I was going to wind up is here I am here today, but being able to follow those interests and those passions for children and for families can sometimes take you on a really unique adventure.
Yeah, that's really fantastic. Thanks so much for sharing that. This is one of the things I think that's really helpful about this format of kind of hearing people's actual experiences in their career trajectory is that you learn that very often there are those unexpected twists and turns where there are kind of opportunities or interests that you develop in the course of doing that job that you wouldn't even have realized, back in college would come up for you. And so, yeah, to Nancy, I want to kind of turn the same question to you about, where the interest for this field initially arose for you, and if there were any of those kinds of twists and unexpected turns in your path.
Yeah, so I, from a young age, knew that teaching was something I definitely wanted to look into, but I was multi-passionate. So I actually didn't go to college for education. I went for a more general liberal arts degree and actually focused in theater and art. And then my senior year was when Hurricane Katrina occurred in New Orleans. And for those of you who aren't maybe as familiar with the events, it kind of devastated the city. And schools were completely shut down. Teachers were all fired across the board. And by the time I was finishing college, the city was starting to rebuild. And I had the opportunity to go on a visit. It was called an alternative spring break a few times, and was able to help in the rebuilding of the city. And so that kind of reignited my passion in education, seeing what was happening down there. But I knew I was graduating without my certificate. So I started to look into alternative route for teaching. So one very popular program you might have heard of is Teach for America. So Teach for America has a mission to take people who didn't graduate with a degree in education and bring them to high needs areas. So usually urban cities or rural areas where there's a lot of farmland and where education is struggling to support students and recruit teachers. So I started to look into Teach for America, but they can place you anywhere. You can kind of give them your top 3 choices, but you could end up in, your home state, or you could end up in California. They have lots of different spots. So I found another program that's very similar. It's alternative route, but it was based in New Orleans, which I knew I really wanted to go to. So it was called Teach NOLA. And I applied to that program and got in. And they got me my first teaching job. And through my first year of teaching, I actually completed my certification. So I had to go to classes at night and kind of earn all of my credits to get my certification. And from there, I was a reading specialist teacher, but I was reminded of my passion for special education, for students who learn differently. I was someone who's very similar to our mentors in our program. I was someone who was always ready to stick up for people with disabilities and make sure that their rights are being met, their needs are being met. So I got recruited to be in a special education department at a charter school. So I mentioned charter schools. Oh, the microphone just cut out. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So charter schools are they are public schools, many of them. Some are private, but many of them are public schools, and they receive their funding directly. So there's no board of education overseeing them, and it gives them a little bit more freedom with their finances, and they are able to recruit kind of teachers who are on the alternative route. And so I started with a charter school down there called New Orleans College Prep. And helped to rebuild special education in that program as the city was starting to rebuild its education system.
So that's kind of how I got started in education, kind of a different route, but really I was able to get my certification, and I love to make sure that all new students know this. You can study many different things and still end up in the field of education. So if you are someone who has a lot of passions and is not really sure what you want to pursue right now, there's lots of different options for you. And Teach NOLO is my route, but Teach for America is also another great program to look into.
That's awesome. And yeah, I wanted to kind of, so taking that kind of like general overview that both of you gave of kind of how your career started off, and rewind a little bit to your time in college and zoom in on that for a minute, just because, you know, that's the place where our students are at right now, and kind of, I think, thinking about, you know, the differences in perspective that you have in college versus what you gain later in your career is really helpful. So just thinking about your experience in college and higher education, and kind of putting yourself back in the mindset of that time. So I guess first question is kind of, you know, thinking about the experiences that our students are coming from. If there were any kind of challenges for you at that point, or any kind of obstacles that you ran into when you were in the process of sort of thinking about what you wanted to do, or you know, beginning to take some of the classes that would get you the degree that would then lead kind of forward toward your career path. As well as the kind of second part of that question is, are there particular experiences that you had in college, either classes that you took or things that you did outside of the classroom, or projects that you engaged with, anything like that, that you feel really did kind of contribute to the, you know, the skills that you would later use in your career? And so we'll start with you again, Dr. Wells.
Those are some great questions. So for the first one, tips for kind of making sure that everything clicks in college. For me personally, my biggest fear was probably time management, because it's the first time that you're doing more independent work. You're expected to keep on top of all of your assignments and things like that. I was double majoring in education and music, and so making sure all my classes lined up and didn't conflict with each other, and that I had time to do everything that I needed to do. But the good news is that in college, you'll be given an advisor who is, that's their job, is to advocate for you and make sure that you have access to the things that you need to. They help you schedule your classes and make sure you're taking everything, so that you don't get to the finish line and then all of a sudden, oops, there was a class you needed to graduate, kind of thing. So I think that the difference from earlier school experiences is, of course, it's much more independent, but that's also really awesome. It's neat to be trusted more as a learner and to be given more independence. So some of the experiences that I think were most transformative for me in college that I've taken going forward are, first of all, ironically, my music major. It sounds a little silly, but as an educator, I use those skills on a daily basis. The performance skills, being able to kind of improvise when something doesn't go according to plan. So I messed up many piano recitals, and I learned from that the ability to just kind of keep going, right? And so I do that daily as a teacher, because things do not go according to plan all the time in our classrooms. Very frequently, they don't go the way we were expecting them to. But then also the ability to just interact with and learn from people who represent such different backgrounds from my own. Sometimes in school, like in K-12 education, we've of course stayed more with our families and we have a smaller group of friends. But then in college, you're bringing people together from all kinds of backgrounds. And so you're exposed to new ideas and new things that I think make me a better teacher, because I realize about all these worlds beyond my own. So I'd say some of those experiences were really important. And also, as an education major, practicum experiences out in the school. So being able to actually shadow a teacher and get that experience definitely was a big event for me as well.
Yeah, that's really great. I think, you know, as part of the education curriculum at Nova, I know that some of our students who are currently going through that are getting some of those first experiences of kind of shadowing or kind of observing classroom environments. And I think that you're 100% right that that kind of experience is going to be some of the most valuable. But I'm really glad that you also highlighted kind of the, you know, broader college experience as something that can be very transformative and really inform you, you know, in your later career. Just the kind of social experiences, or the experiences interacting with other people, are really fantastic for that. And Nancy, it's kind of same question to you in terms of any, you know, challenges or things that you kind of remember struggling with as a college student, as well as things that you really took away and benefited from that experience?
Yeah, I think my answer is very similar to Dr. Wells. I keep nodding my head. I think it's that when you want to pursue education, if you think back to your best teachers, they were always the people who had so much more going on in their lives than being just educators, right? They're the people who were also the basketball coach, or had traveled the world, or had this very interesting life full of different experiences. And I think, I hope this doesn't make you guys mad because you're in the heat of final season. So I'm sure it doesn't feel this way right now. But, now that I'm a mom and I'm working a job that requires me to be somewhere every day, certain times of day, you really have the most time, that a freedom of time that you're ever going to have in college. And so after I got through my first 2 years of learning that time management piece, really understanding how much time I did have and what a unique experience that is to college, I really made sure to use that time, broadening my world, getting different experiences. So I talked about that trip to New Orleans. I decided to go on that trip on a whim. It was through an environmental club, and it really changed my life. It led me to teaching, and I also met my husband on that trip, who would become my husband. So little events like that in college, if you can find opportunities to try out something new, to go on a trip, to build up your courage, I think even if it doesn't look like it'll directly impact your career in education, being able to try those different experiences is super important. I think the other thing to think about is what's important in the world of education is networking. So what I mean by that is, who are the people that you know that are already in the field you're interested in? So when you have those unique experiences, you get to meet other people who are interested in education, other peers, right? And then you all go and start your career, and then these people all over the place who are also working in your field. You can also network with professors. If you build a relationship with a professor, there's someone you can lean on for the rest of your career for advice or to help you find a position. Knowing someone in education is the best way to get a job and to get referred for a job. So not just doing what's required of you in your degree, but also volunteering, going to observe schools, maybe even becoming a substitute teacher for a little bit. And all those experiences can really help you get to know other people in the field and help you continue to expand your career for a long time.
That actually gives a really great transition to my next question, which is going to be about your transition from college into some of your first kind of professional teaching positions. And so, Nancy, you mentioned kind of using this Teach NOLA program as kind of your first step into that, and you've started to mention some of the factors that can help with getting your foot in the door in a new career field, things like networking, building relationships with professors, volunteering, that kind of stuff. But yeah, I wanted to kind of dig into both of your personal experiences with that. I think it can be really intimidating moving from kind of college, getting the degree, getting the education, and then having to actually step into the world of employment. And so I was curious if you guys could speak to kind of your experiences there. So first of all, I guess, how you made that transition, if there were any particular factors that you think were helpful in you being able to get that first kind of professional teaching job. And then I think secondarily, talking about your experience of kind of your first year in the classroom, or your first year in a teaching environment, and what the challenges and rewards of that were like for you.
So the transition to the job market, the good thing about education is there is always a need for teachers. So odds are good that there will be positions open when you're ready. I was unfortunately on the job market during the recession of 2009. So like Nancy's talked about Katrina a few times, I was entering college when that happened. So that was in 2005. And by 2009, that was in the middle of the recession. So there were limited teaching jobs. There weren't enough for all of us. So I left college thinking I was not going to have a job, which was really scary for me. The way that the college structured the program is, I knew I would be back for my 5th year doing a master's degree so that I could teach early childhood education. So I just was finding a place to live, hoping I would find a job to help support myself. And then one of my peers happened to mention, oh, there's a school in Spartanburg, which was 30 minutes away, 45 minutes away from our college, that actually is an arts integration school. And I was like, whoa, what's arts integration? I hadn't really heard of this idea, but I knew that I wanted to not be a music teacher, but I did want to use music in my classroom. Turns out that's what arts integration is when I'm bringing arts into my classroom. So because I already had an interest in the arts and I had majored in music and I had majored in education, I interviewed at the school and wound up getting a job as a third grade teacher. So as I mentioned earlier, my dream was to teach kindergarten, but I knew I couldn't start there because I didn't yet have the teaching credential. So that's one thing as you get your first teaching job. Sometimes we have a dream position that we want. We want to teach second grade, we want to teach first grade, we want to teach fourth grade. And the very first job you get, we accept what we are offered very thankfully, and we get experience in that grade level. And then later there's opportunities if a teacher retires or something like that, then you could possibly move to a different grade level if you still wanted that experience. So it was a really stressful thing at first, figuring out how to create those resumes and how to go to those interviews and things like that. I remember that my first interview at that school was not what I was expecting at all. It was almost like they were selling the school to me. And so just keep that in mind that you as an educator will be in high demand. People will want to work with you. So it's not just that you have to convince them to hire you, but you also get to ask questions back and forth. So I know as a teacher, I like being respected for my professionalism and being able to try new things and integrate the arts and things like that. And if a school is going to tell me, no, you have to use this book and everyone in the school is on the same page at 9:50 a.m., I know that's not something that is good for my soul as a teacher. So the interview process is both ways. You're learning about the school while you're also kind of selling yourself as well. And so the second part of that question is about your first year teaching. Mine was super rough. It definitely was a very difficult year. As we will still tell you in higher education, as we're preparing you as teachers, nothing we can do will 100% prepare you to be a teacher, because a lot of it is the classroom management and all of your practicum experiences. You have that mentor teacher there to kind of support you. And then the first time you are just the leader of the classroom, it's a very different experience. So one of the hardest things for me was that I was teaching, they split the group so that I taught math and science to a morning group and then math and science to an afternoon group. And in the afternoon in third grade, that's a hard time, right? We've just come back from lunch and recess and we're tired. And on top of that, I had a group of students who struggled a little bit with reading and math because they were given the morning reading time because they really wanted, the reading to stick so that the test scores looked good and all that. So by the afternoon, some of my kids they were done. And so we really struggled to find that balance of we have to get back into this and make things work. But then what I wound up doing was my colleagues had told me at first, oh, we don't read aloud in third grade. That's, they're reading to learn at this point, not learning to read. And so I was like, oh, okay. But then I realized, no, I'm going to start reading aloud. And so we came in from recess and I started reading the Wayside Stories book, which is just a super silly book if you haven't read it. My third graders loved it. And that was the transition they needed from being, carefree outside to coming back in, calming back down. And so I fully credit that book with saving my first year of teaching, because I realized that transition I wasn't prepared for. And the book was a great way to keep building literacy skills, build that classroom community, and also get ready for the afternoon. So just be prepared. The first year is usually an interesting challenge. But you have a whole team of people who are there to support you. Your professors from before. I had mentors from both the university and from the school. And that's something that a lot of school districts are doing these days, is providing people who are veteran teachers whose sole job or on the side is to support you and to come in and give you observations and give you pointers and things like that. So my school mentor would come in on Fridays and help me sharpen pencils, things like that. So just little things that really did help me get through that first year.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Nancy, same question to you about that transition from college into your first job, as well as your first year kind of in the classroom.
Yeah, this is making me think not just of my own experience, but I also had the pleasure of mentoring and supporting new teachers. And so I'm thinking a lot about them too. And the number one thing, this is going to seem really silly and very small. One thing that's super important at any job, but especially when you're working at a school, is being on time. And that can seem like such a small thing, but schools work as a community. So if Mr. So-and-so is late and all the kids are coming into the school building and he's not there at his greeting location, or someone's late to be in their classroom for their class, it impacts the whole community. And so you want to make sure if that's something that you struggle with, being on time specifically is a professional skill you're going to want to master, because most frequently when people do leave or are asked to leave in the middle of their first year, that's the number one reason why, is that being on time to your day and also your different locations that you're supposed to be in. And I think I agree with Dr. Wells. The number one recommendation I would have is having a mentor. This can be an official mentor or someone you adopt as your mentor. And that could be another first year teacher. Sometimes someone you're going to go into the room at the end of the day and just be like, this is what happened to me. Because the one thing you'll know in your first year of teaching is you will not be a failure, but you will fail. You will fail students, you will fail to teach a lesson. You're going to experience failure your first year. So you want to rally your people around you and know who you can go to at the end of the day and just be like, well, this stunk. Or I'm having trouble with this particular student. And you also want to make sure people who've been at your school for a while, they're either your official mentor, like you're talking to them, you're asking them questions, or maybe you even just go and sit in their classroom for an hour during your prep, or a half an hour during your prep, to figure out how they do what they do and what you can kind of steal from them. And observing other teachers is the number one thing you can do now. And when you are a teacher, straight up until when I was, considered a veteran teacher at my campus, I was still observing other teachers to figure out how I can take what they're doing and replicate it. Because teaching is two things. It's a science, number one, and things can be replicated. You can figure out how students learn and how their brains work, and you can see what other teachers do and you can follow suit. But the other thing is, teaching is also an art. And you have to love it, and you have to see how other people express their love in their classroom so you can figure out how you can do it too. And I think that's the number one thing I learned my first year. If you aren't feeling the love, either on a particular day for a specific student, for a specific lesson, it can really impact you. Students notice, the lesson doesn't go as well. So as you're transitioning into that first year, figuring out what you truly, really love about teaching. For me, it was the students, and it wasn't necessarily a particular subject area, which gave me a lot of freedom to explore different topics and different classrooms to be in and different roles in a school. And it also allowed me to transition being out of a traditional school. I think that's the last thing I would just make sure that you all, as people considering being teachers, know that there's lots of different fields in education. You can become a para-educator, which requires less education, but can be a very well-paying job. And if you're someone who loves working with students, that might be exactly for you. There's school counselors. Obviously, Dr. Wells and I have transitioned to being fully out of schools, but we're still considered being part of education. So I think that first year, you can really figure out what you truly love about the job. And then you can kind of follow that lead as you go through transitions in your career. Because there are good and bad sides to this, but people very rarely do what all of our teachers do and stay at the same job in the same classroom for straight through to their retirement. And now educators are popping in and out of grade levels, in and out of schools, in and out of subject areas. So knowing what you love allows you to kind of explore those different opportunities for a career that you're going to have for a really long time.
Yeah, that is awesome. And again, you've kind of transitioned toward the next direction I wanted to go with this, which is
it's like we work together or something.
On the same page, 100%. And yeah, so thinking about some of those different options of careers within the field of education, and again, kind of getting inside the perspective of the students here who are kind of at that stage of knowing that this is either something that they're potentially interested in or something that they for sure want to do. But there's kind of such a broad range of careers, as exactly as you were saying, Nancy, kind of under the umbrella of education. And you started to speak a little bit about some of the differences there in terms of what the requirements are, in terms of what the day-to-day of those positions looks like. And obviously this is a huge question, and I don't expect, the two of you to cover like all of the different options that are available within the field of education, but just based on kind of your personal experiences and some of the different positions that you've held, or different kind of phases of your career you've gone through, I was wondering if you could kind of lay out some of those differences in terms of what kind of person might fit best into each of these positions, or if somebody is kind of looking at some of those options from the perspective of a college student right now, what would be some of the ways for them to weigh the pros and cons of those different positions? And yeah, we'll start with you again, Dr. Wells.
That is a huge question. There are so many things that you can do as an educator, and there's some different tiers of it as well. So like Nancy was saying, becoming a paraprofessional or an assistant, you don't have to necessarily always finish that whole teaching credential. Sometimes you can do more of an associate's degree route and things like that. And those paraprofessionals and assistants, what's nice about those positions is you're not usually responsible for planning instruction and things like that. It's more you show up for the school day and you get to go home. Whereas a teacher, you have more responsibilities for planning the instruction and going to meetings and serving on committees and things like that. So the trade-off there is, of course, a paraprofessional, the salary is a little bit less than an actual classroom teacher with a certification to teach. There are lots of different ways that you can serve in education with different routes. So let's say you want to start as a teacher, and then you might want to try something else a few years from then. So one way you could do that is become an administrator. So you can become a principal or an assistant principal. Typically that does require a certain number of years as a teacher, because the best principals are going to understand what's going on in the classroom because of their time in the classroom. You also will have to go back and do a master's degree or something like that in administration. So there is some additional coursework required. Or you can go the route that I went as a literacy coach. Again, requires time in the classroom, also can be a literacy specialist. There's different verbiage there, but same kind of idea. But it does require time in the classroom, certain teaching experience, and then again, some additional coursework. So those are two ways that you can start as a teacher, but then have doors open to you in the future. There's also ways that you can have an interest in serving kids, but not want to do that more traditional routes. So like being a speech pathologist or being an occupational therapist, or all kinds of things like that, that sometimes are outside of the general realm of education, but still are placed in education. School psychologist. Also, sometimes we have family liaisons at schools whose job is to build those communities between families and the school. So they're not necessarily teaching a class or something like that, but they're building those community relationships. So lots of different options depending on what your interests are. I would say some of those, like the principal and literacy coach positions, don't have the same, every day is the same kind of thing, which may or may not be good for you. If you love that routine and you just want to stick with it, something like that that's a little bit less structured might be a little stressful. There are different kinds of expectations in a position like that. Or if the monotony of every single day looking almost exactly the same is kind of making you a little tired of teaching, there are opportunities to still work in education without having the same day schedule every single day.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think one of the important points here that we always want to emphasize when we're kind of doing this, and that I think both of you have emphasized so far, is that you can kind of choose a path to start. And that doesn't necessarily mean that's where you're going to be stuck for your entire career. That, as you said, it's very, very common for people to kind of move around, and you can start off in one position and maybe decide there are some things you like about it and some things you don't. And then other opportunities will kind of open up to you from there based on the experience you have, but that might take it in a slightly different direction. And so you don't necessarily have to have everything 100% figured out right now. You're not making a decision kind of for the rest of your life. But it can still be helpful just to think about some of, what your preferences are and what works best for you personally. And Nancy, same question for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think another thing to think about in making that decision is if you're a person who does need to work, like financially right now, or you're someone who does want to get school done with in one setting. So things like being an occupational therapist, a physical therapist, a speech therapist, you usually stay in school until you're done. I mean, different programs offer different things, but typically that's the route, and you have internships. But if you want to make sure you're always employable, choose one of those areas. They're always in demand, they're always needed, and they also offer flexibility. So many teachers will not stay in the profession as a classroom teacher and after 10 years, right? So being a speech teacher, a physical therapist, a psychologist, if you can go that far and get those degrees, you can start working for yourself. You can contract with schools who maybe don't have those therapists there, and you can kind of bounce around and have complete freedom over your schedule. I think another thing to keep in mind when you think about, teaching is one of the hardest professions in the world. And we're almost like football players, right? Not everybody can be those football players that are playing for years and years and years, that are Tom Brady's, right? Many of us will kind of start to feel fatigued, or maybe teaching doesn't fit your lifestyle. That's the reason I kind of left the classroom. Was I was a young mom and wanted more time with my kids. So just because you start in education doesn't mean you have to end because you're not in the classroom anymore. So I work for a nonprofit. A nonprofit is serving in the community. You need to have specializations and experience, but you have a more typical schedule that will allow you a little bit more flexibility. So you can still work in education, but work for an organization that's maybe supporting children learning to read, or supporting adults learning to read, or supporting adults in college. So that's something to keep in mind. If you do start to experience hardship in the classroom, that doesn't necessarily mean that education isn't for you. You can start using your experiences, figure out what you love about it, and find other opportunities for yourself. I'm also a big fan of substitute teaching. I think that's something that many of you could look into. I think it's a growing field, and I think it would give you a lot of experiences too on what it's like to be a classroom teacher. So I think that's another option that we just didn't discuss. That gives you a lot of flexibility too. They call you and they say, do you want to work today? Or I guess suppose now it's all online. I'm dating myself. But you kind of get to choose whether you're going into work that day, and it does give you that variety. You're not going to see the same students every day at the same school building every day. And it's a great way to start to stay in education without being married to a specific job every single day.
Awesome. And so I just have one last question for both of you before we go to kind of the student Q&A. Which is just kind of in a very general sense, thinking back to when you were first getting into this field, what do you wish you had known back when you were getting started? And what advice would you give to our students who are interested in potentially taking on a career in this field, whether it's in terms of, specific things that they can do now to kind of make themselves more marketable as a teacher, or specific ways that they can prepare themselves for that job experience. Any kind of advice or thoughts that you have about that?
So the biggest advice that I give to my future teachers, I actually teach an intro to education class at Mary Washington, and we just talked about this week. It seems a little bit like a different piece of advice, but think of families as your supporters. My first year teaching, I was really scared of my families. I sometimes would hear things like, "Oh, are you sure you're a teacher? You look like you should still be in high school," and things like that. And so I felt like I really had to defend myself almost to prove that I was a worthy teacher, kind of thing, which sometimes made it really hard for me to work in collaboration with my families. For some reason, I had this mistaken idea that they weren't going to think of me as a real teacher and all this kind of stuff. And so, what I tell my future teachers is to remember that our families are our experts. They are our children's first teachers. They have a lot of information to share. And every once in a while, as a teacher, sometimes I have to bring news back to a family about a student who's having a hard time or things like that. And that's really hard to hear. And sometimes they'll push back a little bit. And again, that's where I read that as, oh, they're threatening my authority. But really, if we realize that we're all working towards the same goal, all we want, families and teachers, is for their kids to have the best possible chances for success. And we're on that team together. Sometimes we have different views of how we're going to get to that. But if I step back and realize we're in this together, we are a team, we're here to advocate for kids, I think that really helps build those connections with families. Are those discussions going to be hard sometimes? Absolutely. But that doesn't mean that a family just doesn't like you or doesn't respect you or things like that. They want to advocate for their kids too. So thinking of families as partners, as the experts in their students, is something I knew a little bit more about when I first started teaching. And that's actually turned into one of my big research interests is how do we support teachers with making connections with families?
Great. And Nancy.
So the best piece of advice I got my first year of teaching, and it was show them the love. And you're going to have a lot of people telling you what you should or shouldn't do in your classroom, what's the right thing to do, what are the skills you need. But if you can find small moments in your day where you're showing students how much you love them or how much you love your profession, all those things are going to fall into place and make the hard work of being a teacher more enjoyable. So, if you like playing music in your classroom, while students write, play music in your classroom while students write, like those small little moments to show them who you are and what you love about it. And then more practical advice too, because I come from the charter school world, there is a book called Teach Like a Champion that's very highly used, especially in charter schools. It comes with videos. It comes with videos that you can read how to do specific things in your classroom, and then they actually show you expert teachers doing it. They also have trainings, which you can sometimes attend at specific schools, or they do have workshops themselves. But I think watching those videos and seeing those little tiny moves, something as simple as scanning a classroom, you can learn how to do different teaching techniques that really can go a long way. Even if you haven't started your formal career or education in education, those are things that you can start using as a self-study tool right now as you explore this as a possible route for yourself.
Well, thank you both so much.